The courtroom was silent. The air felt heavy as the accused sat in the defendant's chair, his hands gripping the edges of the table in front of him. The judge, an older man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the case file. "Defendant, please state your name," the judge said, his voice firm yet calm. The young man in the chair swallowed hard, his throat dry. His clothes were slightly worn, his face tense, but his eyes were familiar. The judge squinted, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. "My name is Jason Carter," the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge's heart stopped. His breath caught in his chest. It was impossible. The name, the face, that scar just above his right eyebrow. A memory flashed in his mind. An old newspaper clipping of a missing boy, a desperate father searching for his lost son. The gavel nearly slipped from his grip as his hands began to tremble. "Jason Carter?" His voice cracked slightly. "Are you sure?" The young man frowned, confused by the judge's sudden change in tone. "Why, yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward, staring deep into Jason's face. His fingers clutched the wooden bench as a single thought echoed in his mind. "This is my son." Then, the realization struck him like a thunderbolt. His lost son. The boy who had disappeared from his life 12 years ago. Now, he was sitting in front of him, accused of a crime. The courtroom grew restless. Murmurs filled the air as the judge's reaction did not go unnoticed. The prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged puzzled glances. The bailiff shifted uneasily. But the only sound the judge could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. The silence stretched. Then, finally, the judge opened his mouth. What is the charge?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The prosecutor stood up, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant is accused of robbery and assault." The judge's breath hitched. His son, his lost child, a criminal? His mind raced. How? Why? Where had Jason been all these years? What had led him to this moment? The young man turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the judge's face. Something about the older man's expression made his stomach twist. There was something in those blue eyes. Recognition? Fear? Sadness? Jason couldn't explain why, but a strange feeling gripped him too. Who was this judge? And why did he look at him like that? The judge's hands trembled as he lifted the gavel. He had a decision to make. But what happened next shocked everyone. 12 years earlier, the rain poured heavily, drumming against the city streets as a young boy, no older than 6, ran as fast as his tiny legs could carry him. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched his little teddy bear close to his chest. He had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. He had let go of his father's hand. The last thing he remembered was standing at the crowded train station, his father kneeling in front of him, fixing his jacket. "Stay close to me, okay, buddy," his father had said with a warm smile. But the moment his father turned around to pick up their bags, Jason had seen a puppy running past. Without thinking, he had chased after it. One moment he was reaching for the fluffy tail. The next, he was lost in a sea of strangers. "Dad?" he had called out. "Daddy?" But no one answered. The train station was busy, people rushing past him. His small voice was swallowed by the noise. He tried to push through the crowd, his tiny hands reaching out, but no one stopped. And then, he saw the train doors close. Through the window, he saw his father's face, frantic, searching. Their eyes met for a brief second. Then, the train pulled away. Jason banged on the glass, screaming, but the train was gone. And just like that, he was alone. For days, Jason wandered the streets, scared and hungry. He cried for his dad, but no one helped him. People passed him by, too busy with their own lives. The world was cruel, and Jason quickly learned that kindness was rare. One night, he met a man named Ray, a rough-looking man with scars on his face and a cigarette in his mouth. Ray found him shivering in the alley behind a restaurant. "You lost, kid?" Ray asked, crouching down. Jason sniffled, hugging his teddy bear. I want my dad." Ray exhaled, shaking his head. "Parents don't come looking for kids like you," he muttered. Then, he stood up. "But if you want to survive out here, you better toughen up." Jason was only 6, but that night, he made a decision. If the world wasn't going to be kind to him, he wasn't going to be kind to the world. He followed Ray, and for the next 12 years, he lived on the streets, doing whatever it took to survive. Jason learned how to fight, how to steal, and how to trust no one. He hardened his heart, because kindness had never saved him. Only strength had. Now, 12 years later, he sat in the courtroom, facing the judge, an old man who looked strangely familiar. He didn't know why, but his heart was pounding. And then, as the judge opened his mouth to speak, Jason felt something inside him shift. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And then, bang, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A woman rushed in, her face pale. "Your Honor," she cried, "there's been a new development in the case." Everyone turned. Jason's hands clenched into fists, because whatever this new development was, he had a feeling it was about to turn his world upside down. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the woman who had just burst into the courtroom. She was out of breath, holding a stack of papers in her shaking hands. The judge, still reeling from the shock of seeing his lost son, tried to compose himself. "What new development?" he asked, his voice struggling to stay steady. The woman hesitated for a second before stepping forward. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that suggests Jason Carter may not be guilty of the crime he's been accused of." A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Jason's eyes widened. Not guilty? His hands clenched into fists. Was this some kind of trick? The prosecutor looked annoyed. "This is highly unusual. We were ready to proceed with the trial. What kind of evidence do you have?" The woman turned to Jason. "Surveillance footage," she said. "It proves he wasn't the one who committed the robbery." Jason felt the air leave his lungs. He had expected this trial to go badly. He had spent most of his life believing the world was against him. But now, someone was saying he wasn't the villain in this story? The judge adjusted his glasses, his heart racing. "Bring it forward," he said. A guard took a USB drive from the woman and inserted it into the computer. A screen lowered from the ceiling, and the footage began to play. The courtroom watched as a grainy video of a convenience store filled the screen. It showed a man, dressed in a black hoodie, walking inside. He pulled a gun on the cashier, demanding money. Jason leaned forward. His stomach tightened. That wasn't him. The figure in the video turned slightly, revealing his face. Jason's eyes widened in shock. It was someone he knew. Ray, the man who had taken him in all those years ago. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor's face paled. Jason's attorney let out a slow breath. "Your Honor," he said, "this is clear proof that my client is innocent. He was accused falsely." The judge felt a lump rise in his throat. His son wasn't guilty, but that wasn't the only thing racing through his mind. He had just seen his son for the first time in 12 years, and now he had to decide what happened next. The judge picked up his gavel, his fingers gripping the wood tightly. But before he could make a ruling, Jason shot up from his chair. "Wait." Everyone turned to him. Jason's voice was sharp, his muscles tense. "Where did you get that video?" he demanded. The woman hesitated. "We found it in a nearby security database," she said. "It was recently uploaded." Jason's mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Ray wasn't the kind of guy who left evidence behind. If this video had surfaced, someone wanted it to. His blood ran cold. Ray was watching. And if Jason knew anything about his old mentor, that meant trouble. Before Jason could say another word, a guard approached the judge's bench and whispered something in his ear. The judge's face darkened. He looked at Jason. "There's someone here to see you," he said. Jason's stomach twisted. The doors opened again, and standing in the doorway was Ray. 12 years ago, Jason sat on the cold pavement, his arms wrapped around his knees. The city lights flickered above him, casting long shadows in the alley. Ray sat next to him, tossing a cigarette onto the ground. "You learn quick, kid," he said. Jason didn't respond. His heart still ached from losing his father. But after months on the streets, he had learned something important. No one was coming to save him. Ray nudged him. "You want to survive? You listen to me." Jason looked up. His eyes, once filled with innocence, were starting to harden. Ray smirked. Forget your past. The world doesn't care about lost kids. You're either strong or you're dead. Jason swallowed hard. So what do I do? Ray leaned in, his voice low. You do what you gotta do. And from that moment on, Jason followed Ray's rules. Until now, Ray stepped into the courtroom, his boots clicking against the tile floor. He looked different than Jason remembered. Older, meaner. Jason's whole body tensed. The judge gripped the edges of his bench. He could see the shift in Jason's posture, the way his fists clenched, the way his breathing changed. He wasn't just looking at a man from his past. He was looking at a threat. Ray smirked. Been a long time, kid. Jason didn't say a word. Ray turned his attention to the judge. I hear you're about to let my boy go, he said casually. That's a good choice. The room was thick with tension. The prosecutor stood frozen, unsure what to say. The guards were on edge. Jason's mind raced. If Ray was here, it wasn't just to watch. He had a plan. And Jason had a gut feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't end well. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Carter is no longer a suspect in this case, he said firmly. He will be released. Ray's smirk widened. Good. He put his hands in his pockets. Because I've got another job for him. Jason stiffened. What? Ray leaned in just enough for Jason to hear. You owe me, kid. Jason's heart pounded. Ray turned to the judge. You wouldn't want to see your son in trouble again, would you? Jason's stomach dropped. Ray wasn't just here to watch. He was here to pull Jason back in. And if Jason refused, he knew Ray wouldn't let him walk away so easily. The judge saw the unspoken battle in Jason's eyes. And in that moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't lose his son again. Not this time. He gripped his gavel tightly. Then, he made a ruling. One that would change everything. The next words out of his mouth would decide Jason's fate. The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the judge, waiting for his ruling. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained steady. He had spent years making difficult decisions, sentencing criminals, upholding justice. But now, he wasn't just a judge. He was a father. And the man standing before his son was dangerous. His fingers gripped the gavel. Then, with a firm voice, he spoke. Jason Carter is free to go. This case is dismissed. The gavel came down with a loud bang. A wave of relief washed over Jason. He was free. He wasn't going back to prison. But that relief didn't last long. Ray chuckled, shaking his head. That's nice and all, Your Honor. He placed his hands in his pockets. But I don't think the kid's going anywhere. Jason's body stiffened. Ray turned to him. Come on, Jason. Let's go. Jason's fists clenched. He knew what Ray was doing. He wanted to remind Jason that freedom wasn't as simple as a judge's ruling. That in the real world, debts had to be paid. And Jason owed him everything. The judge's heart sank as he saw the hesitation in Jason's eyes. He could see the years of hardship on his son's face. The scars, the exhaustion, the fear hidden behind the tough expression. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore. This was a battle for his son's soul. The guards moved cautiously, waiting for the judge's command. The prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable, shuffled through his papers. Then, the judge did something unexpected. He stood up. The room tensed. Judges rarely stood in court. It was a symbol of authority, a sign that something serious was about to happen. Jason, he said, his voice softer now. You don't have to go with him. Jason's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe those words. He really did. But Ray had been the only person in his life for 12 years. The one who fed him when he was starving. The one who taught him how to survive when the world turned its back. Ray had saved him. But now Jason had to decide. Had he been saved or trapped? Ray chuckled again, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you, Judge? He took a step closer. You might have given him a legal way out, but out here? He tapped his chest. The rules are different. Jason's breathing was shallow. He knew Ray was right. Walking away wouldn't be easy. Ray wasn't just a street thug. He was connected. Dangerous. If Jason turned his back on him, there would be consequences. The judge could see the war happening inside his son's head. And for the first time in years, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He stepped down from the bench. Gasps echoed through the room. The judge walked past the attorneys, past the guards, past the rows of watching eyes. And then, he stood directly in front of Jason, face to face with his son. Jason swallowed hard. He had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, that he was fine on his own. But now, standing here, looking into the eyes of a man he barely remembered, he felt something strange, something warm, something terrifying. Hope. The judge took a deep breath. Then, he said the words that changed everything. You don't owe him anything, Jason, but you have a choice. Jason's heart pounded. Ray smirked. Yeah? And what's that? The judge looked at Ray. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. You can leave my courtroom. The room fell deathly silent. Jason's breath hitched. The judge wasn't just talking to Ray. He was talking to him, too. This wasn't just about a legal case. This was about whether Jason would keep living in the world Ray had built for him, or if he would finally walk away. Ray's smirk faded. His eyes darkened. Jason's fingers twitched. He had spent his whole life being told what to do, being pushed, being shaped. But for the first time in years, someone was telling him he had a choice. His father was telling him he had a choice. Jason turned to Ray, and then he said two words. I'm done. A sharp silence followed. Then, Ray's smile vanished. Jason had seen that look before. It meant trouble. Before anyone could react, Ray lunged, and chaos erupted in the courtroom. Guards shouted. The prosecutor gasped. The judge's eyes widened as Ray pulled something from his jacket. A knife. Jason's instincts kicked in. He moved fast, dodging to the side. Ray's blade slashed through the air, barely missing him. People screamed. The guards rushed forward. But Jason wasn't a scared kid anymore. He had spent 12 years fighting to survive. And now, he was fighting for something more. For freedom. For himself. For the first time, he fought back. Ray came at him again, but Jason grabbed his wrist, twisting it hard. The knife clattered to the floor. The guards tackled Ray, pinning him down. Jason stood there, his chest rising and falling, his heart racing. Ray struggled against the guards, his face twisted in rage. You think this is over, kid? He spat. You think the world's just gonna let you walk away? Jason met his eyes, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid. I don't care, he said. I'm done living by your rules. Ray was dragged out of the courtroom, cursing the whole way. Jason stood frozen, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. Then, he turned. His father was watching him, not as a judge, as a dad. Jason swallowed hard. So, what now? The judge took a slow breath. Then, he said something Jason never expected. Come home. Jason's stomach twisted. He wanted to. He really did. But could he? Could he really walk away from everything? Was he even worthy of a second chance? Jason looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred, calloused from years of survival. He wasn't the little boy his father had lost. He wasn't sure if he even knew how to be a son. The judge saw the hesitation in his eyes. So, he did the one thing Jason never expected. He opened his arms. A simple gesture. But it shattered something deep inside Jason. For 12 years, no one had ever held him. No one had ever told him he was safe. Jason's throat tightened. His vision blurred. For the first time in a long, long time, he wanted to believe in something. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward. And for the first time in 12 years, Jason let someone hold him. Someone who wasn't Ray. Someone who actually cared. The courtroom was silent. No one spoke. Because everyone knew something special had just happened. A lost son had been found. But Jason's journey wasn't over yet. Because outside that courtroom, a storm was waiting. And his past wasn't done with him yet. The world outside the courtroom felt different. Jason stood at the courthouse steps, his hands shoved into his pockets, staring at the busy street ahead. Cars honked. People walked past, lost in their own lives. It was the same city he had known for years. But for the first time, he wasn't looking at it as a runaway. The judge, his father, stood beside him, watching him carefully. There was an awkward silence between them. Not tense, just unfamiliar. Jason glanced at him. You don't have to do this, you know. The judge sighed. Do what? Jason exhaled. Pretend like this can work. He shook his head. I'm not that little kid you lost. His father didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed his hands in his pockets, staring at the passing cars. I know, he said finally. And I'm not the same father I used to be either. Jason frowned. He hadn't thought about that. He had spent so many years thinking about how much he had changed, how much he had suffered. But his father had suffered too. 12 years. 12 years of not knowing, of hoping, of losing hope. Jason swallowed hard. Maybe neither of them knew how to do this. His father cleared his throat. You hungry? Jason hesitated. He was. But he wasn't used to people asking. Yeah, he muttered. The judge nodded. Let's go eat then. They ended up in a small diner a few blocks away. It was the kind of place Jason had only walked past before, never gone inside. Warm, clean. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. Jason felt weird sitting at the table, like he didn't belong. He was used to cheap food, eating on the go, not a place with menus and waitresses who actually smiled. The judge didn't push him. He just ordered 2 plates of pancakes and coffee. Jason stared at the cup in front of him. He felt out of place, like a stray dog someone had brought into their home. His father must have sensed it. You can relax, Jason, he said gently. Jason scoffed. Relax? After what just happened? He shook his head. Ray's not gonna let this go. The judge's face darkened. I know. Jason tapped the table, thinking. You don't understand. Ray's got people. He's connected. If he thinks I turned on him, his jaw clenched. It won't stop at threats. The judge studied him for a long moment. Then let's be ready. Jason frowned. You don't get it. Ray doesn't play fair. His father's eyes didn't waver. Neither do I. Jason blinked. He hadn't expected that. The judge sipped his coffee, calm as ever. You think I made it to where I am without knowing how to deal with dangerous men? Jason leaned back in his chair. His father had always been this untouchable figure in his mind. Strict, by the book, a man of law. But now, sitting across from him, Jason saw something else. He saw a man who wasn't just a judge. He was a father who had just found his son again. And he wasn't going to lose him. Jason swallowed hard. So what? We just wait for Ray to come after me? The judge set his coffee down. No. We get ahead of him. Jason frowned. How? His father leaned in. By making sure he can't touch you. Jason exhaled, shaking his head. Easier said than done. The judge was silent for a moment. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number. Jason listened as his father spoke in a low, serious voice. Detective, it's me. We need to talk. Jason's stomach twisted. He knew that tone. His father was planning something, and whatever it was, Ray wasn't going to like it. Somewhere in the city, inside a dark bar, Ray sat at a corner booth, his hands clenched into fists. He was still furious. The kid had turned on him. After everything. After all those years of training. Of protection. Of turning him into someone strong. Jason had thrown it all away for some old man in a robe. A man Ray should have made sure stayed out of the picture years ago. A man who had power. Ray exhaled sharply. This wasn't over. Jason might think he was free. But he wasn't. He belonged to the streets. To him. And if Jason thought he could just walk away, he had another thing coming. Ray pulled out his phone and dialed a number. A deep voice answered. Yeah. Ray's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. I need a favor. Jason and his father walked out of the diner, stepping into the cool night air. The city felt quiet. Too quiet. Jason had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, something felt off. He shoved his hands in his pockets, glancing at his father. So, what now? The judge gave him a look. You're coming home with me. Jason's stomach twisted. The word home felt foreign. He hadn't had one in years. But before he could respond, screech. A black car pulled up fast. Too fast. Jason barely had time to react before the doors flew open, and 3 men in black masks jumped out. His blood turned to ice. Run, the judge yelled. But it was too late. One of the men grabbed Jason, yanking him back. He struggled, throwing an elbow, but they were strong. Too strong. Another man swung a fist at the judge. knocking him back. Jason's vision blurred as something hard struck his head. Pain exploded through his skull. Then, darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went black was his father calling his name. And then Jason was gone. A throbbing pain pulsed in Jason's skull. His head felt heavy, his body sluggish. His vision blurred as he blinked himself awake, the faint scent of gasoline and damp concrete filling his nose. He wasn't outside anymore. His hands were bound. His ankles, too. He was sitting in a chair, metal and cold, inside a dimly lit room. A single bulb flickered above him, casting eerie shadows against the cracked walls. Jason's heart pounded. Where was he? Think. His last memory was the diner. Walking outside. The car. The men. His father yelling. Then, nothing. His breathing was slow, controlled, but inside, panic twisted his gut. He had been kidnapped, and there was only one person who could have ordered it. Ray. A slow, mocking clap echoed through the room. Jason tensed. A shadow moved near the doorway. Then, Ray stepped forward, his usual smirk plastered across his face. Took you long enough to wake up, kid? Jason clenched his jaw. He wanted to lunge at him, but the ropes held him tight. He didn't speak. He wouldn't give Ray the satisfaction. Ray chuckled. You always were a fighter. He crouched in front of Jason, his scarred fingers drumming against his knee. But this was a stupid move, kid. Jason's eyes burned with anger. Let me go. Ray sighed dramatically. Oh, Jason. He shook his head. You don't get to walk away from me. Jason yanked against the ropes. I don't belong to you. Ray's smile vanished. His fingers suddenly gripped Jason's chin, forcing him to look up. That's where you're wrong. Jason didn't flinch. He had spent his whole life learning how to survive. And he knew one thing for certain. Ray wanted control. He wanted fear. Jason wouldn't give him either. Ray studied him for a long moment. Then, he let go and stood up. You think just because you found your long-lost daddy, you can start over? He scoffed. That ain't how this works. Jason's fists clenched. Yeah? And how does it work? Ray leaned in close. You owe me. Jason's stomach turned. Ray exhaled, shaking his head. I took you in when no one else did. I fed you, trained you, protected you. And now you think you can just walk away? He clicked his tongue. I don't let people walk away. Jason's breathing steadied. I never asked for your help. Ray's eyes darkened. He moved so fast Jason barely saw it coming. His fist slammed into Jason's jaw, snapping his head back. Pain exploded in his face. But Jason didn't cry out. Ray stood straight, shaking out his hand. Still as stubborn as ever. Jason spit blood onto the floor, his breathing heavy. He lifted his gaze, fire burning in his eyes. You can hit me all you want, Jason growled. I'm still not coming back. Ray tilted his head, then let out a laugh. Oh, kid. He stepped back, pacing. You really think this is about you? Jason's stomach twisted. Something about Ray's tone made his skin crawl. Ray grinned. I'm not worried about you, Jason. He pulled out his phone, holding it up. Jason's blood ran cold when he saw the screen. A photo of his father, bound, bruised, sitting in a chair just like him. Jason's entire body locked up. Ray smirked. Now, let's talk about his future. 30 minutes earlier. The judge's vision was still swimming when he finally regained consciousness. His head throbbed, and his hands were tied behind his back. His judge's robe was gone, his dress shirt wrinkled and stained with blood. He lifted his head, blinking at the dim surroundings. He was in a different room than Jason. An old warehouse, by the looks of it. Rusted beams. Concrete walls. No windows. Then, a voice spoke. You really screwed this up, Judge. The judge looked up. A tall man with dark eyes stood in front of him. Not Ray. Someone else. Someone meaner. You got in the way, the man said. Ray doesn't like that. The judge's mind raced. Jason wasn't here. That meant Ray had separated them. That wasn't good. The man crouched, looking him in the eye. You think you can just take one of Ray's people and walk away? He clicked his tongue. That's not how the world works. The judge straightened his shoulders. Jason is not Ray's. The man smirked. Funny. Ray says the same thing about you. The judge's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a warning. This was leverage. They were using him against Jason. The judge exhaled. He had spent years in courtrooms. He had seen criminals, murderers, gang leaders. But this was different. This was personal. And he was about to find out just how far Ray was willing to go. Back in Jason's room, Jason's body was rigid, his breathing sharp. His mind screamed at him to stay calm, but his blood was boiling. Ray had his father. Jason knew what that meant. Ray wouldn't kill him, not yet. He was using him as a pawn. Here's the deal, kid. Ray sat on the edge of the table, spinning his phone in his fingers. You come back. Work for me. No more running. No more playing happy family. Jason's fists clenched. Ray smirked. Or well, he tapped the screen. A live video feed popped up. Jason's heart nearly stopped. His father was on the screen. Beaten. Tied up. His head hanging forward. Ray sighed. I'd hate for something to happen to dear old Dad. Jason's jaw locked. His stomach twisted in rage. You touch him and I swear. Ray laughed. You'll what? You're tied up, kid. He leaned in. This isn't the part where you fight back. Jason's breath was ragged. He knew how this worked. He had seen people break before. Ray was pushing him to the edge. And it was working. Jason couldn't lose his father. Not again. Ray clapped his hands. So, what's it gonna be? Jason's breathing slowed. His eyes darkened. He knew Ray expected him to beg, to give in. But Jason wasn't that scared kid anymore. He looked up, meeting Ray's gaze head-on. And then, he smirked. Ray's grin faltered. Jason's voice was low. Steady. You just made a mistake, Ray. Ray arched a brow. Oh yeah. Jason leaned forward, his eyes burning. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Before Ray could react, Jason ripped his arms forward, snapping the zip ties against the sharp edge of the chair's metal frame. Ray's eyes widened. Jason lunged. And in that moment, everything exploded into chaos. Jason moved fast. His muscles screamed, but he ignored the pain. His mind was on one thing, his father. Ray's eyes widened, caught off guard as Jason slammed into him, knocking the phone out of his hand. The device skidded across the floor, the video feed flickering. Ray stumbled back, cursing. Jason didn't wait. He threw a hard punch, crack, connecting with Ray's jaw. The older man staggered, but Jason didn't stop. Another punch, this time to his ribs. Ray grunted, doubling over. Jason's heartbeat pounded like a drum. Keep moving. Don't stop. He reached down, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the floor. His fingers gripped it tightly. Ray recovered fast. He wiped blood from his lip, then smirked. You've learned a few tricks. Jason's grip tightened on the glass. You taught me. Ray chuckled. Guess I shouldn't have. Then, he lunged. Jason dodged, barely. He slashed the glass forward, swipe. But Ray was faster. He caught Jason's wrist, twisting it. Jason gritted his teeth as pain shot up his arm. Then, with his free hand, he drove a knee into Ray's gut. Ray gasped, staggering backward. Jason didn't hesitate. He spun, kicked Ray's leg out from under him. The older man crashed to the floor. Jason pounced, grabbing him by the collar. His breathing was ragged. His fingers curled into fists. He could end this right now. He could make sure Ray never hurt him or his father again. Ray saw the hesitation. He smirked, blood dripping from his lip. Do it. Jason's muscles tensed. Ray's voice dropped to a whisper. You and I both know you're just like me. Jason's jaw clenched. Then, slowly, he let go. Ray's smirk faltered. What? Jason's hands trembled. His whole life, he had been told he was nothing more than what the streets made him, that he was just another lost cause. But now? Jason exhaled. No, he shook his head. I'm not like you. Ray's eyes darkened. Before he could react, Jason grabbed the phone off the floor. He fumbled with it, pulling up the video feed. His father, still bound, still hurt, but alive. Jason's pulse thundered. He turned to Ray, his voice deadly calm. Where is he? Ray sneered. You really think I'd tell you? Jason clenched his fists. His vision blurred with rage. He wanted to break Ray. But then, boom, the warehouse door exploded open. Light flooded in. Voices. Shouting. Footsteps pounding against the concrete. Jason turned and saw his father's men. Police officers. Detectives. His father leading them. Jason's chest tightened. The judge was battered, his face bruised, but he was standing. The second their eyes met, something inside Jason cracked. His father's voice was strong, unwavering. "Step away from him, son." Jason's breath hitched. His father had called him son. For the first time in 12 years. Jason didn't hesitate. He dropped the phone, stepped back. Ray growled, trying to get up. Bang! A gunshot shattered the air. "Stay down." One of the officers barked, aiming his weapon. Ray froze. In seconds, police swarmed him, pinning him to the ground. Handcuffs clicked. It was over. Jason stood there, breathing hard, his whole body trembling. Then, his father was there. The judge didn't say a word. He just pulled Jason into a tight embrace. Jason tensed for a second. He wasn't used to this. To warmth. To safety. But then, he let himself sink into it. For the first time in years, Jason felt something unfamiliar. Something he never thought he'd have again. Home. Hours later, Jason sat in his father's car, staring out the window. His hands were still shaking. His father was silent beside him, hands gripping the wheel. Finally, the judge spoke. "You okay?" Jason exhaled. "I don't know." His father nodded slowly. "That's okay." Jason swallowed hard. "What happens now?" The judge glanced at him. "That's up to you." Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" His father's voice was gentle but firm. "You've spent your whole life surviving, Jason. Now it's time to live." Jason's chest tightened. Could he? Could he really start over? His father sighed. "I can't force you to stay. But if you want a real life, I'll help you." Jason hesitated. He had spent years believing he had no choices. But now, sitting here, next to the man who never stopped looking for him, he did have a choice. Jason looked down at his hands. Scarred, worn, but not broken. He exhaled. Then, for the first time in a long time, he nodded, and his father smiled. For the first time, Jason felt like maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. But the past doesn't let go so easily. And as they drove away, a single black car followed them. From a distance, watching. Because Ray wasn't the only enemy Jason had made. And the real fight was still coming. The city lights blurred outside the car window as Jason stared out, his thoughts heavy. His father drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. He glanced in the side mirror. The black car was still there, keeping its distance. Not too close, not too far. Jason's stomach twisted. He knew how these things worked. This wasn't just a random car. They were being followed. He inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Dad." The judge didn't take his eyes off the road. "Yeah." Jason's fingers tightened on his jeans. "Don't react. Just check the mirror." His father's expression didn't change, but his grip on the wheel shifted. His eyes flickered up to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. A moment passed, then another. His father's voice was even. "How long?" Jason exhaled. "Since we left the station." His father didn't curse, didn't panic. Instead, he nodded slightly. "Okay." Jason frowned. "Okay." His father's jaw tightened. "We don't go home." Jason blinked. "What?" "We don't lead them to the house." His father made a sudden turn, cutting down a smaller street. The black car followed. Jason's pulse picked up. "They're still on us." His father nodded. "Yeah, I figured." Jason clenched his teeth. "You think it's Ray's guys?" His father didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed sharp, scanning the road ahead. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not taking any chances." Jason's mind raced. If Ray was behind this, it meant one thing. Ray had contingency plans. He knew he'd be caught. He knew he might not walk free. And that meant he left instructions. Jason exhaled sharply. Of course, Ray wasn't the type to go down alone. His father suddenly pulled the car into a parking garage, tires screeching slightly. He didn't slow down, weaving between concrete pillars before finally pulling into a dark corner, hidden from view. Jason's breath hitched. What are we? Shh, his father turned off the engine. The silence in the car was thick. Then, the black car rolled in. Slow, calculated. Jason held his breath as it passed them. The headlights scanned the garage, searching. Then, the car stopped. Jason's heartbeat hammered. A door opened. Footsteps. Jason's fists clenched. His instinct screamed at him to move, to fight, to run. His father's voice was barely a whisper. Stay low. Jason's muscles coiled. Then, a knock on the window. Jason's pulse spiked. His father's jaw tightened. Then, cautiously, he rolled the window down just enough. A man stood outside. Tall, broad shoulders, dressed in a black suit. His expression unreadable. Jason had never seen him before. The man's voice was smooth. Judge Carter. Jason's stomach twisted. His father's voice was calm, controlled. Who's asking? The man slipped a business card through the gap in the window. The judge took it, glancing down. His brow furrowed slightly. Jason leaned over. The card was plain. No name, no company, just a phone number. The man smiled faintly. We need to talk. Jason's gut told him one thing. This wasn't Ray's guy. This was something worse. His father exhaled slowly. About what? The man's expression didn't change. About Jason. Jason's blood ran cold. His father's voice dropped to something lethal. We're done talking. The man's smile didn't fade. You don't understand, Judge. His eyes flicked to Jason. This isn't about Ray. Jason tensed. Then what is it about? The man's voice was smooth. It's about unfinished business. Jason's breath hitched. He didn't like the way that sounded. His father didn't either. He reached for the gear shift. We're leaving. The man took a step back, hands raised. Of course. Jason felt his muscles coil. Too easy. Then, bang. A car door slammed behind them. Jason spun around. Two more men, both in suits, both blocking the exit. Jason's heart pounded. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take him. His father's voice was sharp. Jason, hold on. Then, the car lurched forward. His father hit the gas. The tires screeched against the concrete. Jason braced himself as the car whipped around, dodging the men just as one of them reached for a gun. Jason's breath caught. A gun. He barely had time to react before. Bang, bang. Gunfire erupted. Jason ducked. His father swerved the car, dodging the bullets as they sped toward the exit. Jason clenched his fists. What the hell is this? His father's voice was tight. Not Ray. Jason's stomach turned. Then who? The car burst onto the street, tires screeching as his father yanked the wheel, weaving through traffic. Jason turned, breathless, watching the black car in the distance. It wasn't following. Jason exhaled sharply, but he knew this wasn't over. He looked at his father. Who were they? His father's jaw was tight. Jason had never seen that look before. Then, his father's voice was low. Something I thought I left behind. Jason's heart pounded. And me. His father exhaled. They don't want me, Jason. He turned, looking at Jason dead in the eye. They want you. Jason's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. Ray might have been behind bars, but Jason had just walked into something far worse. Something bigger. Something that had been waiting for him all along. And whoever they weren't done with him yet. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. The streetlights blurred as his father sped down the road, weaving through traffic like a man who had just realized the past wasn't done with him. The air in the car was thick. Jason could barely breathe through the tension. His father's jaw was clenched so tight, he looked like he might snap the steering wheel in half. Jason exhaled slowly. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Who were those guys? His father didn't answer at first. His hands gripped the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Jason frowned. Dad. Still nothing. Jason's patience snapped. Who were they? His father exhaled sharply. His voice was low. I don't know. Jason scoffed. Bull. You knew something. I saw your face. His father's fingers flexed against the wheel. I have suspicions, but I need more than that. Jason clenched his jaw. Great. His whole life, he had believed Ray was his worst problem. Now, there were men in suits with guns after him, and nobody was telling him why. He rubbed his face. This just keeps getting better. His father finally turned to him. Jason, listen to me. These men, whoever they are, aren't random. They knew your name. They knew me. His jaw tightened. And they don't work for Ray. Jason frowned. Then what do they want? His father was silent for a moment. Then, he said the last thing Jason expected. I think this goes back to the day you disappeared. Jason's breath hitched. What? His father's grip on the wheel tightened. I never believed you just got lost. His voice was raw. You were there 1 second, then gone. No witnesses. No leads. He exhaled. And now, after 12 years, men in suits show up the moment I get you back? Jason's stomach twisted. He had never thought about it that way. He had always believed he was just a kid who got unlucky. Chased after a puppy. Got separated. Lost. But what if he hadn't just gotten lost? What if someone had taken him? Jason's fingers curled into fists. What does that mean? His father glanced at him. It means we need answers. Jason exhaled. And where do we start? His father's voice was steel. With the only person who might know. Jason frowned. Who? His father didn't hesitate. Ray. Jason froze. Ray. The man who raised him. Trained him. Controlled him. The man he had just put behind bars. Jason swallowed. You think he knows? His father didn't take his eyes off the road. I'd bet my life on it. Jason exhaled sharply. Fantastic. They had just escaped one mess, and now they were running straight into another. 30 minutes later, city jail. The air inside the jail was thick with the stench of sweat and metal. Jason had been in places like this before. The walls, the fluorescent lights, the low murmur of inmates talking in the distance. But this time, he wasn't on the inside. This time, he had the power. Jason followed his father down the hallway, his heart pounding. His hands still ached from the fight earlier. His ribs were sore. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the man sitting in the interrogation room ahead. Ray. A guard unlocked the door, stepping aside. The judge entered first. Jason followed. And there he was. Ray sat at the metal table, his wrists cuffed. He looked up at them, his lips curving into a slow smirk. Well, Ray drawled, leaning back. Didn't expect to see you again so soon, kid. Jason clenched his fists. His father stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Who were the men in suits, Ray? The judge asked flatly. Ray chuckled. Straight to business, huh? He tilted his head at Jason. No warm reunions? Jason's jaw locked. Answer him. Ray exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You Carter boys. So impatient. The judge leaned forward, his voice like ice. I don't have time for games. Who were they? Ray tapped his fingers on the table. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. The judge's eyes darkened. Try me. Ray studied him for a moment, then turned his gaze to Jason. His smirk faded slightly. Then, finally, he spoke. You ever heard of the Hale Syndicate? Jason frowned. No. His father, however, stiffened. Ray chuckled. Yeah, he has. He nodded toward the judge. Go ahead, Carter. Tell the kid the truth. Jason turned to his father. What is it? His father's jaw was tight. An organization. International. Dangerous. Jason's stomach twisted. Ray smirked. Ding, ding, ding. Give the man a prize. Jason's mind raced. He had lived in the underworld long enough to know names meant power. And if Ray was naming names, that meant trouble. Ray leaned forward. Here's the fun part, kid. His eyes gleamed. They're not after me. Jason's pulse spiked. Then who? Ray grinned. You. Jason's breath hitched. Ray chuckled darkly. 12 years, Jason. 12 years you've been running, and you didn't even know it. He spread his arms. Congrats, kid. You just stepped into a game you were born into. Jason's stomach churned. Born into? His father's voice was dangerously calm. Why Jason? Ray's smirk widened. Ask him. He nodded toward the judge. Jason turned to his father, his chest tight. Dad. His father exhaled sharply. Then, for the first time, He looked tired. His voice was low. Because I wasn't always a judge. Jason's heartbeat stopped. Ray grinned. Now we're getting somewhere. Jason swallowed hard. What were you? His father was silent. Then, finally, he looked Jason in the eyes and said 4 words that changed everything. I was one of them. Jason's world tilted. His breath caught. His stomach dropped. His father, the man of law, the man of justice, had once been part of the Hale Syndicate. Jason stumbled back, his head spinning. No, he shook his head. That's not possible. Ray laughed, slamming his hands on the table. Oh, it's possible, kid. His eyes gleamed. And trust me, they don't forget their own. Jason's chest was tight. His mind raced. His father wasn't just fighting to save him. He was fighting against his own past. And the Hale Syndicate? They weren't done with either of them. Jason's stomach turned. Because now, he wasn't just running from Ray. He was running from something much bigger. Something that had been waiting for him his whole life. And they were finally coming to collect. Jason felt like the air had been punched from his lungs. His father, a former member of the Hale Syndicate? It didn't make sense. The judge had always been a man of law, of justice. He had built his entire life on doing the right thing. But now, Ray was sitting there, grinning like he had just revealed the world's biggest joke. And Jason? He wasn't laughing. His father's face was unreadable. I left that life a long time ago. Ray smirked. That's cute. You really think you can just walk away? He shook his head. Jason, kid, listen to me. You were never lost. You were taken. Jason's pulse spiked. What? Ray leaned forward, eyes sharp. That day at the train station? That wasn't an accident. Jason's stomach twisted. His father inhaled sharply. Don't listen to him. Ray cut him off. Oh, so you never told him, huh? He clapped his hands. Man, this just keeps getting better. Jason's breath was shallow. His mind raced. Tell me what? His father's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter. Jason's patience snapped. It matters to me. Silence. His father finally exhaled. Then, his voice dropped to something low. Controlled. Dangerous. They took you because of me. Jason's hands curled into fists. His father kept going. I wasn't always a judge. I was recruited young. I worked for the syndicate. His eyes darkened. And then I walked away. Ray snorted. Oh, sure. Because walking away from an international crime syndicate is super easy. The judge ignored him. His eyes stayed on Jason. I left when I realized what they really were. I erased my past, built a new life. A real life. Jason swallowed. And then, his father's breath hitched. And then I had you. Jason's heart stopped. Ray grinned. Now he gets it. Jason's voice was barely a whisper. They didn't take me by accident. His father closed his eyes for a second. No. Jason's chest tightened. They took me to get to you. His father nodded once. And when they couldn't keep you, his voice broke slightly. You disappeared. And so did they. Jason's pulse pounded. The pieces were finally falling into place. He had always thought he was a kid who got unlucky. A kid who got lost in a crowd. But no, he was a target. And now, they were back. Jason pushed a hand through his hair, his heart slamming against his ribs. So what? They've been waiting this whole time? Ray smirked. No, kid. They've been watching. Jason's blood turned to ice. His father's expression darkened. Jason, we have to go. Ray laughed. Yeah, you should. His smile turned sharp. Because if the Hale Syndicate wants you? He leaned in. You're already running out of time. 1 hour later, safe house. Jason sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor. His mind was spinning. His father moved around the small apartment, securing the locks, double-checking the windows. He had brought them to a safe house, a place Jason assumed judges weren't supposed to have. But then again, Jason was realizing his father wasn't who he thought he was. Jason exhaled slowly. How much worse is this gonna get? His father didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed a small metal box from a closet, setting it down on the coffee table. Jason frowned. What is that? The judge opened it. Inside, there was a gun. A sleek, black pistol. Jason had seen a lot of weapons before, but this wasn't standard police issue. Jason's stomach churned. Dad. His father's voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath. We need to be ready. Jason clenched his jaw. So that's it? We just go to war? His father's eyes met his. We don't have a choice. Jason exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. This is insane. His father sat across from him. I know. Jason lifted his gaze. Why didn't you ever tell me? His father swallowed hard. Because I wanted to protect you. Jason scoffed. Yeah? That worked out great. His father exhaled, rubbing his hands together. Jason, listen to me. The Hale Syndicate doesn't forgive. They don't forget. He hesitated. If they're after you, that means they want something. Jason's chest felt tight. Like what? His father's eyes were sharp. You. Jason's blood turned cold. He had spent his entire life surviving, fighting, running. But now? Now he had to decide if he was ready to fight back. Before the Hale Syndicate found him first. Then, crash. The window shattered. Jason barely had time to react before. Boom. A flashbang grenade hit the floor. Jason's world erupted into white light. His ears rang. His vision blurred. Then, shouting. Footsteps. Jason struggled to move, but his body wouldn't listen. Then, just before the darkness swallowed him, a deep, unfamiliar voice. We got him. Jason's heart slammed against his ribs. Then, everything went black. Jason's world was a swirling mix of pain and confusion. His ears still rang from the flashbang grenade, his head pounding like a hammer against steel. The air was thick, damp. The faint scent of metal and gasoline burned his nose. His wrists bound, his ankles tied. He was strapped to a chair. Again, Jason's eyes slowly adjusted to the dimly lit room. The walls were concrete, cold and unwelcoming. A single hanging bulb flickered above him, casting eerie shadows across the floor. A warehouse. He was back in the underworld. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The last thing he remembered was the safe house. His father. The explosion. The shouting. And then, nothing. Jason inhaled slowly, forcing his mind to focus. Think. Where was his father? A door creaked open. Footsteps. Slow. Calculated. Then, a man stepped into the light. Tall. Well-dressed. A gray suit with silver cufflinks. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. His face was sharp, clean-cut, too perfect. And his eyes? Cold. Empty. Dead. Jason had spent years around dangerous men. But this guy? He wasn't just dangerous. He was something worse. The man adjusted his cufflinks, sighing as if Jason was some kind of inconvenience. Then, finally, he spoke. Jason Carter. Jason's jaw tightened. He refused to answer. The man smirked. Your father was right. You do have a stubborn streak. Jason's stomach twisted. His father. He forced his voice to stay steady. Where is he? The man ignored the question, stepping closer. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete floor. You've been very difficult to find, the man continued. But you see, we have a rule. Jason's pulse quickened. A rule? The man crouched in front of him, his voice dropping to a whisper. No one leaves the Hale Syndicate. Jason's blood turned to ice. His jaw clenched. I was never in it. The man chuckled. Oh, Jason. He shook his head. You were born in it. Jason's stomach twisted. The man sighed, standing up. I was hoping to have this conversation under better circumstances. But unfortunately, he gestured around the warehouse. You didn't leave us much of a choice. Jason's breath was shallow. His mind raced. What do you want? He asked, his voice sharp. The man smiled. I thought you'd never asked. Then, he snapped his fingers. The door opened again. Jason's heart stopped. Two men walked in, dragging his father. Jason's entire body locked up. His father looked battered, bruised. His hands were tied, his face covered in sweat and dirt. But he was alive. Jason's breath hitched. Dad. His father lifted his head, eyes heavy but focused. I'm fine, he rasped. Don't give them anything. The man in the suit sighed. You judges. So dramatic. He turned back to Jason. Let me make this simple. His smile vanished. You have something we want. Jason frowned. What? The man leaned in. A legacy. Jason's pulse pounded. What the hell does that mean? The man's lips curled into a slow, calculated smile. Your father was one of the best. He knew things, did things. But he walked away. He placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, squeezing slightly. And you? His voice dropped to a whisper. You're his blood. You're the perfect replacement. Jason's stomach twisted. His breath caught. You're kidding. The man's grip tightened. Do I look like I'm kidding? Jason's jaw locked. The pieces clicked together in his head. The Hale Syndicate didn't just want him dead. They wanted him to join them. His blood ran cold. No, his voice was steel. I'm not your guy. The man sighed, rubbing his temples. You Carter men. He shook his head. Always making things so difficult. Then, he turned to his men. Make him understand. Jason barely had time to react. A fist slammed into his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. He gasped, coughing hard. His ribs screamed in pain. Another punch, this time to his face. His vision blurred. His father shouted, struggling against his restraints. Jason! The man in the suit turned to the guards. Enough. Jason's head pounded. Blood dripped from his lip. His breathing was sharp, but his mind was still clear. He lifted his head slowly, spitting blood onto the floor. Then, he grinned. The man arched a brow. Something funny? Jason chuckled, despite the pain. Yeah. His voice was hoarse. You think you can break me? The man sighed. Oh, Jason. I don't need to break you. He turned to his guards. Bring her in. Jason's chest tightened. Her? The door opened again. Footsteps. Then, Jason's entire world stopped. A girl stepped into the room. Late 20s. Dark eyes. Sharp features. But what caught Jason off guard was the look on her face. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't struggling. She was calm, like she had been here before. The man in the suit smirked. Jason, meet Lena Hale. Jason's breath hitched. Hale, as in Hale Syndicate. Lena met his gaze. Then, she spoke. It's time you learn who you really are. Jason's heart slammed against his ribs. Everything he thought he knew about his past, his father, and himself was about to change. Forever. Jason's world tilted. Lena Hale. The name rang in his head like an alarm. She stood there, calm, composed, like she wasn't a prisoner at all. Like she wasn't just dragged into this mess. Jason's chest tightened. Something was off. His father shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched. Jason could see the flicker of recognition in his father's eyes, but also something else. Fear. That scared Jason more than anything. The man in the suit, still nameless, still as eerily composed as ever, smiled slightly, sensing the tension. She knows you, Jason. He gestured toward Lena. And, more importantly, you know her. Jason shook his head. I don't know her. Lena tilted her head. You don't remember. It wasn't a question. Jason's patience snapped. I don't know what game you're playing, but I have never met you in my life. Lena's lips parted slightly, like she had expected that answer but hated hearing it. The man in the suit chuckled. Ah, memory is a tricky thing, isn't it? He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Lena's shoulder. But that's okay. She remembers everything. Jason exhaled sharply. Enough with the mind games. Who is she? The man's smirk widened. She's your sister. Jason's lungs froze. His entire body locked up. His father closed his eyes, like he had been dreading this moment. Jason's breath came out shaky. What? The man in the suit clasped his hands behind his back, nodding at Lena. She's your blood, Jason. The sister you never knew you had. Jason's stomach twisted violently. This was a lie. It had to be. He turned to his father, expecting him to deny it, to tell him this was just another twisted manipulation tactic. But his father wouldn't meet his gaze. Jason's pulse spiked. Dad. His father's shoulders were rigid. Jason. His voice was hoarse. I wanted to tell you. Jason jerked against his restraints. Tell me what? That I have a sister? That my entire life is a lie? His father's jaw tightened. I thought she was dead. Jason's chest collapsed in on itself. Lena watched him carefully, like she was waiting to see how he would react. Jason's head spun. This couldn't be real. The man in the suit sighed, looking amused. This is why secrets are dangerous, Judge Carter. He turned to Jason, his smile fading. The truth is, you were never lost. You were separated. Jason's hands clenched into fists. Why? Lena finally spoke. Because we were supposed to grow up as heirs to the Hale Syndicate. Jason felt sick. His father exhaled sharply. I didn't want that life for you. For either of you. Jason's pulse roared in his ears. So you just, what? Took me and left her behind? Lena's eyes flickered with something sharp. He didn't take you. She looked at their father. He abandoned me. Jason froze. His father's breath hitched. Lena, don't. Her voice was cold. I waited for you. I waited years. And when I realized you weren't coming back. She lifted her chin. I stopped waiting. Jason swallowed hard. So what? You work for them now? Lena sighed. Jason, you don't get it. We are them. Jason's heart slammed against his ribs. No, I don't belong to this. Lena's gaze softened slightly, but only for a second. Then, it hardened. You can't run from your own blood. Jason breathed sharply. Watch me. The man in the suit chuckled, clearly enjoying the tension. But then, his face darkened. This isn't a choice, Jason. Jason stiffened. The man continued, voice calm but dangerous. You either embrace your place in the syndicate, his gaze flickered to his father, or I start taking away the things you love. Jason's entire body coiled. The message was clear. His father, his life, everything he had just fought for. All of it was a bargaining chip. Jason's fists shook against the ropes. His whole life, people had controlled him. First the streets, then Ray. Now this? But the difference now? He wasn't that scared kid anymore. Jason inhaled deeply, steadying himself. His ribs ached, his wrists burned, but he ignored it. Then, he looked at Lena. Her face was unreadable, but Jason saw the conflict. The hesitation. She wasn't as cold as she pretended to be. Jason's voice was low, deadly. If you really are my sister, he said, then help me get out of here. The man in the suit laughed. Oh, Jason, that's not happening. Lena's fingers twitched. Jason saw it. She was hesitating. The man in the suit sighed. I was hoping you'd see reason, but I see now. He motioned to one of his guards. A gun cocked. Jason's heart lurched. The guard pressed the barrel against his father's temple. The man in the suit tilted his head. You will join us, Jason. His father closed his eyes. Jason, don't. Jason's chest collapsed. His pulse spiked. Then, something snapped. Lena moved. Fast. Before the man in the suit could react, she lunged. A knife flashed in her hand. Jason's breath caught as she slashed the guard's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. Chaos erupted. Jason kicked off the ground, throwing his chair backward. He hit the floor hard, but the impact snapped the chair legs. His wrists were free. Adrenaline surged. Lena grabbed a gun from one of the guards and tossed it to him. Jason caught it. The man in the suit's expression darkened. Lena. She turned to him, gun raised. I'm not leaving him behind, she said, voice firm. Jason stared. She was choosing him. The man in the suit sighed. What a shame. Then, more guards stormed in. Jason swore under his breath. Lena turned to him, her eyes sharp. We need to go. Now. Jason looked at his father, still bound, still bleeding. His muscles coiled. They weren't dying here. Jason cocked the gun. Then, together, he and Lena fought their way out. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunfire rattled through the air. Jason and Lena moved in sync, dodging, weaving, fighting for their lives. Jason had never fought alongside anyone before. Not like this. But with Lena at his side, it felt natural. Like they had done this before. Like they really were family. A guard lunged at Jason. He ducked, slamming his elbow into the man's ribs, grabbing his gun before he hit the ground. Lena fired 2 precise shots, bang, bang. 2 more guards went down. Jason twisted, covering her as she moved toward their father. The man in the suit stood by the far door, his face unreadable. Unbothered. He wasn't running. He wasn't afraid. Jason clenched his jaw. That was bad news. This isn't over, Jason realized. Not even close. Lena cut the ropes from their father's wrists, steadying him. He was weak, but his eyes were sharp. "We have to move," she said, tossing Jason another spare magazine. Jason nodded, reloading his weapon. "Which way?" Lena's eyes flicked toward an open corridor. "Back exit. I saw it when they brought me in." Jason's mind raced. They had maybe 2 minutes before reinforcements came. No time to hesitate. He turned back to the man in the suit, his grip tightening on his gun. "This isn't over." The man smirked, amused. "No, Jason, it isn't." Jason clenched his jaw. He wanted to end it, but not yet. He turned and ran. Lena followed, pulling their father with her. They weaved through the warehouse, adrenaline surging, dodging bullets as more guards tried to block their escape. Jason moved fast, his instincts sharper than ever. His entire life had led to this moment. He wasn't running anymore. He was fighting back. Bang. A guard went down. Bang. Another. They reached the back exit. A heavy steel door. Jason shoved his shoulder against it. Locked. Lena spun, her gun raised. "Cover me." Jason whirled, firing at the guards chasing them. "Hurry." Lena ripped a knife from her belt and jammed it into the lock, twisting. Snap. The door swung open. Jason grabbed their father and hauled him through. The cold night air hit them like a shockwave. Outside. Finally. Jason turned, slamming the door shut behind them. Then, silence. Jason's chest heaved. His hands shook. They had made it. But this wasn't victory. This was just the beginning. 1 week later, Jason sat on the rooftop of a quiet building, staring out at the city. Lena stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. His father was inside, still recovering. The injuries had been bad, but he would survive. They all would. For now. Jason exhaled. "They're still out there." Lena nodded. "They always will be." Jason studied her carefully. His sister. It still felt surreal, but part of him knew. Deep down, he had never been alone. Not really. Lena turned to him. "What happens now?" Jason exhaled slowly. "I don't know." Lena smirked. "Good answer." Jason looked at her. "You sticking around?" She hesitated. Then, she nodded. "Yeah." Jason swallowed. "Why?" Lena's expression softened. "Because you're my brother." Jason felt something in his chest shift. He wasn't used to this, having people. But now? Maybe he wasn't just surviving. Maybe he was actually living. He turned back to the city. Somewhere out there, the Hale Syndicate was still watching, waiting. But Jason wasn't afraid. He had his father. He had his sister. And for the first time in his life, he had something to fight for. A real life. A real future. He clenched his fists, his resolve solid. They wanted him? Let them come. He was done running. And this time, he was ready.